Welcome back to the Wholesome Reader. We are continuing with Father to Nobody's Children, Chapter 5, No Destitute Child Ever Refused Admission. Encouraged by Shaftesbury's support, Dr. Bernardo began to dream big. The children of the East End had to be educated, and boys like Jim Jarvis had to be given a place to stay. So it seemed logical that a ministry needed to be created that was not a ragged school or an orphanage, but included elements of both. In 1868, readers of a major Christian magazine opened their latest issue to find an announcement of a new ministry being formed in the East End of London. A mission to the poor was being launched by Bernardo with an evangelistic tea meeting. In England, tea is a mid-afternoon meal. Readers were invited to contribute to the expenses of this new work. When contributions were less than half what Bernardo hoped for, he scaled back his plan. But the first tea meeting attracted over 2,000 men, women, and children, so many that they had to be fed in shifts. The long wait for food led to some rowdiness, but that stopped when Bernardo stood up to speak. His preaching had an amazing effect on the restless crowd. They listened attentively. A number stayed for the altar call and were converted. In spite of this, Bernardo didn't consider the first meeting that successful. Perhaps he felt it appealed more to the stomach than to the soul. At any rate, he began looking for a more effective way to draw an audience. To publicize the evangelistic meetings, Bernardo and his helpers would march through the neighborhood before the service, carrying banners announcing its time and location. These little parades were often attacked by people throwing trash and spoiled fruit, at least at first. Gradually, the workers began to win over the suspicious and cynical, and after a few months their campaign began to have effect. Ironically, their very success was their downfall. When a new owner took over the building where they held their meetings, he felt the tea meetings were hurting his tavern business down the street. One Sunday afternoon, the workers arrived to set up for the meeting and found the doors shut in their faces. The owner had decided the hall was no longer available for rent. Whether from frustration over this setback or the frantic pace he had kept up for weeks, Bernardo became ill and was bedridden for 2 months. Without his leadership and no place to meet, the tea meeting scheme collapsed. Flat on his back and low on money, Bernardo had soon discovered what good friends he really had. His small band of helpers refused to allow the ministry to die. Under his direction, they rented what Bernardo later described as a small room in a poor street, and started a program of weeknight activities. One night the room was a ragged school, another night it served as a reading room. Still another night they held a sewing class there. The results were so encouraging that the failure of the tea meetings was eventually seen as a blessing in disguise. The cost of renting the large hall had made it impossible to conduct as well-rounded a ministry as Bernardo's helpers could in a small rented room. Like his thwarted call to China, Bernardo soon realized God's hand in the sudden end of the tea meetings. As his first major failure, it taught him a valuable lesson in dependence on God. Any confidence Bernardo had in his own abilities and plans was thoroughly surrendered to Christ. He also discovered that his previous work had not been in vain, for it opened the hearts of the residents of the area. He was now a familiar figure, and usually a welcome one to the people of the East End. In January of the next year, Bernardo was well enough to personally begin searching for a larger meeting room. In March, the ministry moved to 2 small cottages on Hope Place, one for boys, one for girls. And at this time, the work was given its first official name, the East End Juvenile Mission. Soon the mission had organized weekly prayer meetings and Bible classes for children, young people, and adults. A wide variety of free services were offered to the poor, everything from a library to an employment agency. Regular church services were conducted each Sunday, with Bernardo preaching. The mission Sunday school swelled to an attendance of over 300. Workers had to borrow benches from neighbors and set them out on the sidewalk to provide a place for the students. In the meantime, Dr. Bernardo had not forgotten about Jim Jarvis and many other homeless boys in his ragged school, as well as those he met in his frequent nighttime explorations in the city. He had found temporary homes with Christian families for Jim and a few other boys, but there were too many needy children to solve the whole problem that way. Besides, some of the boys had been on the street so long that they were too wild to be placed with a family. They needed discipline. They needed to learn the very basics of Christianity. They needed to be taught a trade, as well as how to read and write. Eventually, these boys began finding a home at the East End Juvenile Mission. The next year, 1869, the mission expanded to 2 more houses on Hope Place. The walls that separated the backyards of the 4 cottages were torn down, and a roof put over the area, creating a hall to seat 300. Yet the mission was still crowded. Every time they enlarged the space, they expanded the programs at the mission. Every time they expanded the programs, more people came. By the spring of 1870, the neighbors were complaining about the crowds. Something had to be done, especially if Bernardo wanted to house homeless boys in addition to the Bible studies, ragged school classes, and various other activities at East End Juvenile Mission. On a nearby street called Stepney Causeway, Bernardo found a large building that could be leased quite cheaply. This was to become the first of the Bernardo homes. The only problem was it had to be renovated to make a suitable home for boys, and where was the money to come from? Through word of mouth to the good doctor's friends and a modest appeal in a local Christian magazine, some contributions began to come in. The work on the building began. But because Bernardo refused to borrow money for the new venture, the renovations were often delayed for lack of funds. In a letter to a friend during one of the slack periods in contributions, Bernardo confessed, "I fear I shall be compelled in a few days to call off the workmen and suspend operations, as I am quite determined not to go into debt." Finally, in December, the home was opened for business and was almost immediately filled. By now, it was 4.5 years since Bernardo had set foot in London. The ministry seemed to be growing rapidly enough, but in the next few years it was to go through a virtual explosion. The cause of this amazing expansion was due to another of Bernardo's seemingly insignificant encounters. It became a habit of Bernardo's to search the marketplaces and back alleys of East London for children sleeping outside. Late one night in May, he was a little too successful. Though he had only 5 empty beds, he encountered over 10 times as many homeless boys. Reluctantly, he picked out 5 of the saddest-looking ones. It was difficult to choose, and he remembered the disappointment on the faces of several boys, including an 11-year-old with flaming red hair named John Somers. John, who was nicknamed Carrots by the other boys because of his hair, pleaded with the doctor to be let into the home. In the process, he told a little about his background. Carrots never knew his father, and his mother sent him out on his own at the ripe old age of 7. He picked up a few odd jobs, but what he earned often wasn't enough to get him food and shelter. The only time he saw his mother was when she would catch him on the street, wrestle him to the ground, and take the few coins he had. Then she would disappear into the nearest liquor store for a bottle of gin. If he had no money, she would scream at him and beat him unmercifully. Bernardo said about the experience later, "I had seldom seen a more unpleasant specimen of boy life than Carrots." This was quite a statement from a man who had seen so many underfed and ill-treated children. All available beds had been taken, but the doctor gave Carrots a hot meal and promised that there would be room for him in about a week. The boy seemed satisfied with that and stepped out into the night with a hopeful heart. A few days later, in an area of the city called Billingsgate, some workmen moved a barrel and discovered two boys apparently asleep. The first woke immediately and ran away, but the other didn't stir. One of the workmen shook the boy, with no response. On picking him up, the men realized the limp, cold form was dead, the result of exposure to the cold and lack of food. The boy was Carrots. As soon as he heard, Bernardo came to see where the boy had been laid. Several homeless boys were already there, weeping over their friend. "Did Carrots love Jesus?" the doctor asked one of the smallest of the mourners. "Oh, sir, we never hears of him," the child replied, "except when somebody's cursing and swearing." "Well, you at least will hear something better," Bernardo replied, and took the boy into the home at Stepney. The death of Carrots touched Bernardo deeply. He felt responsible. God had called him to rescue homeless children, yet he had turned this poor soul away from his door, all because he was worried about staying within his budget. Guilt can drive a man crazy or drive him to God. For Bernardo, it led to a momentous decision. He resolved before the Lord that he would never again turn away a child who was truly needy. As an act of faith, he hung a sign over the Stepney orphanage. "No destitute child ever refused admission." Some of Bernardo's previous supporters considered his decision impractical, even radical. Most other orphanages had stiff requirements for admission. The child had to be a member of a certain church, or had to have someone to vouch for him, or make a donation. Bernardo's orphanage changed all that. From now on, there would be only one requirement for admission: destitution. The child had to be without friends or family, with no place to live. Whenever a child showed up at his door, Bernardo would investigate the matter thoroughly. Often he was able to find a relative or friend who could provide a good home, but when no one else was available, he always took the child in. "No destitute child ever refused admission" became the rallying cry for an organization that quickly grew to gigantic proportions. The Stepney ministry soon expanded from 1 to 5 homes. Once Bernardo decided to completely trust God to provide for the ministry, he had his hands full. There were always plenty of homeless children. But waiting for children to come to him was not enough for Bernardo. He began to seek them out himself. During the daytime, Bernardo was busy with the ministry and his medical studies. Yes, he was still working on his medical degree, and it was useless to look for needy children when they were up and about. They would run away before he had a chance to win their confidence. There was only one solution. He had to do his hunting at night. And that's the end of chapter 5.